And welcome to the new episode of the Standard, a fantasy football podcast. I'm your host, Jono, and again, my co-host, Chris, joins us today to a all but exciting debate that spans across all fantasy football leagues.
The debates of debates.
Do you go PPR or standard when it comes to scoring formats? Personally, I've always been a standard player. I've been playing since the late 90s with my family leagues. Even through the 2000s, I still always ran standard. I did, however, play in multiple PPR leagues, so I do know that format, so it's not a one-sided debate or even one-sided opinion. I've played in multiple types of PPR leagues and bonus leagues, but I still prefer standard. I don't know. What are your thoughts?
I mean, I played in both. Same thing. Late 90s, just grew up on standard. I played PPR. I've won in both. I've had great success in both. I prefer standard. I think it's a much more challenging format to do. Touchdowns are not predictable. Catches are. We know who are going to get the volume catches. And I think the game has shifted from what it was 20 years ago. And we'll go into more detail on that, but the landscape of the NFL has completely changed to where PPR is, dare I say, outdated. At least full point PPR is outdated.
Yeah, I agree with you on that, 100%.
I can see some half point PPR, but even there, you have this weighted statistic, and it's just, honestly, it's points for being points.
Yeah.
There's so many players out there, unless you're in a 14 plus person league, which most people aren't. I would say most leagues are either 12 person or under. You don't need that depth of players. Like every year we see, or every year and every week of every year, there's at least 5 to 10 guys on a waiver wire that are going to score double digit points. So people making wrong moves isn't an excuse for making more points for other players.
Yeah, and let's back up a little bit before we start getting really heated. I can see the sweat beading up on your forehead already.
Oh, yeah.
So let's talk about PPR and when it actually came to fruition and the reasoning behind it, or so the data out there shows, and all the articles that you ever find written about when did PPR start and why did it start. It started back in 2003. I think ESPN was the first format to run it. Before that, it was always a standard league. That being said, once it rolled out, if you look at the statistics, and I'll go into the numbers real briefly, and it's mind-blowing actually why people still want to play PPR for certain reasons. For other reasons, makes sense. But in 2003, it came on because you had the age and era of the bell cow back, the all down back, the 300 rushes per season back on a majority of the NFL teams across the league. And so wide receivers took a back seat to that. And in order to, quote unquote, add value to wide receivers deeper in the line of depth of wide receivers, you add in PPR to kind of boost some points and bring some value to some guys that otherwise wouldn't have it. And again, it makes sense so that teams who are running back heavy in a fantasy league or draft two guys that are 300 rush per season guys and 1,500 yards or 1,200 yards and 10 touchdowns each don't dominate the league and just cruise to the finish line. However, when you look at the numbers, it really has significantly changed. It made sense back in 2003 because running backs did dominate the early 2000s. I will say in the 90s, it still was across the board. They averaged about 9 running backs with 300 rushes per season. 16 running backs a season had 1,000 yards in the 90s, and this is the late 90s, and they averaged around 9 running backs with 9 or more touchdowns. Well, wide receivers weren't too far behind. You averaged 21 wide receivers in the late 90s with 1,000-yard seasons. Now, only 3 hit that benchmark of 100 catches that you see for a receiver, but you had 12 on average per season score 9+ touchdowns. So there's not a big discrepancy. It's really when you start to get into the 2000s that you see the early 2000s where you would see certain seasons where you'd have, okay, maybe you had 12 running backs that touched the ball 300 times. And then you have another maybe 21 that went for 1,000 yards. In the fact of the early 2000s, you had on average 18 that would run for 1,000 yards. Wide receivers, it wasn't always that case. There were highs and lows based on the season, and more highs at the tail end of the 2000s than there was at the beginning. But now when you hit the 2010s, PPR should have been dissipated. It should have gone away for that same purpose. And we'll talk about why I think it stayed, but 2010s, you dropped down significantly. You had an average of 2 rushers a season going for 300 touches, 12 for 1,000 yards, and average 8 with 9+ touchdowns. Wide receiver wise, you were averaging 5 for 100 receptions a season. 22 on average per season went for 1,000 yards, and 13 receivers per season on average. And that, average is the average. Obviously, it could be higher and lower, but 13 went for 9+ touchdowns. Numbers skewed way in favor of the wide receiver. And it just goes to show, because you had quarterbacks throwing for maybe average on per season, 2 or 3 quarterbacks would throw for 4,000 yards. As of 2010s, they were on average 10 quarterbacks throwing for 4,000 yards or 5,000 yards.
And even now in the last 5 or 6 years, the guys that aren't throwing for 4,000 yards, they have high rushing totals. So from a fantasy perspective, those quarterbacks that aren't throwing for 4,000 yards, they're on teams that are quarterback run heavy. But if you look at the landscape across the NFL over the last 10 years, what have we seen? More points scored per game, more offensive yards, and more offense total per game. And so when you have quicker scoring and higher scoring, a lot of that is not coming from the running back production. Now, I will say in the last couple of years, we have seen running back rushing totals go up from maybe 10 years ago, and not quite what it was in the 90s. But you don't have the 16 bell cows a bell cow on every team, and then that backup. So many teams are running back by committee, and we're going to see so many this year. Like we thought, take Seattle for example this year. We thought Kenneth Walker, okay, Penny's gone, Kenneth Walker is going to be the bell cow there. Nope, they go and draft another kid because teams don't want to run a one running back system anymore. And so you have so much more depth at the running back position, but then you also have depth at the wide receiver position. Look across the league and look at how many number 2 receivers are topping 1,000 yards.
Correct. I mean, look at T. Higgins, Mike Williams. Look at these guys.
Devonta Smith.
Yeah, I agree.
So many across the board as a number 2. Yeah. And so you have just more totals, more yardage, and more receptions in total. And there's a lot of arguments to why PPR shouldn't be a thing. And my biggest, the biggest argument I've kind of heard is like, oh well, it quantifies like their production in a system. It quantifies like their involvement in a system. That's volume. All right. We've heard for 20 years, volume is king. Volume is king. We hear that from the running back position. It's all about getting the guys that have volume. Well, why? Like they don't get points for that volume. Why should a wide receiver or tight end get points for volume? If they're converting those catches, they're going to get the yardage with that and potentially touchdowns with that. So why are they rewarded on top of that by just making a catch? And
well, especially because the yardage, point per yard is exactly the same as a running back. And you can argue too that the running back gets more opportunities throughout a season than a wide receiver. But if you look at the rushing average, yards per carry versus yards per reception, receiver's always going to have more yards per reception than a yards per carry. Period.
Right.
So it doesn't matter the volume on there. And to prove your point, talking about 2000s, we're not seeing more than 2 running backs in the past 3 seasons. In a given season, I think maybe 3 one of the seasons ran for 300 touches because it's just spread out throughout the offense. And only 10 on average have gone over for 1,000 yards. That number is so much drop, whereas you're talking about 22 receivers on average in the past 3 seasons are gone for 1,000 yards. That
Yeah.
that tells you if you're going for what we're talking about here, 1 point for every 10 yards, and you have 10 running backs getting 1,000, getting 100 points off their yardage, but you're getting 22 receivers and tight ends that are doing that over the past 3 seasons. How does that data not prove that the league has changed? There's been a shift, and wide receiver value is actually more important. And you have more, like you said, running backs by committees and less bell cows. That like you said, the volume, you want to quantify volume and their involvement in the offense. Well, the numbers prove it itself. You don't need to add extra on top of that.
And here's an argument. So, I know a lot of times you talk about like, oh, it's just points for being points, and PPR is just running up the point totals. In standard last year in our league, we had 3 or 4 times where people topped 150 points in standard. So when we first started our league 12 years ago, we didn't have most of the time it was like a 90 to 100 game. Now we're putting up point totals that are 150 to 120. So across the board, numbers have gone up: receptions, touchdowns, rushing yardage,
quarterback touchdowns, quarterback yardage.
Touchdowns,
yeah,
all of it has gone up. So why do we need to inflate points even more, especially for players that aren't relevant? And we kind of talked about it earlier today. Is like, let's take an example just from last season, right? On a wide receiver example.
I've got a
Chris
couple,
Godwin,
so go ahead.
Yeah, we have a couple. Chris Godwin last year had his total at the end of the season, not counting receptions, his total at the end of the season was 1,023 yards, and he caught 3 touchdowns. Now, in a PPR format, he had a better season than Garrett Wilson, who had 1,120 yards and 4 touchdowns. So Garrett Wilson had more yardage and more touchdowns, but was outscored in a PPR format by another player.
Simply
and that's
for
ridiculous to me, is because production is production. Touchdowns and receiving yardage is production. And it shouldn't be about how many catches you make. It should be about what you're doing with those catches.
Yeah, I mean, let's just go on a couple other players from last year that just show how skewed PPR scoring can be. And, people say, well, you guys got to draft different, you got to play it different. I don't know. You get somebody like DJ Moore in a standard format, had a fantastic season. He was wide receiver number 19. Had he been in PPR, he would have dropped 5 spots outside of the top 20 receivers to wide receiver 24. 5 spots can be minute, but it could also be significant. You look at somebody like Christian Watson, standard league, wide receiver 25, drops all the way to wide receiver 41 in a PPR league. Gabe Davis, number 24, drops to 36. George Pickens was, teetering on breaking inside the top 30, and he's teetering on dropping out of the top 40 in PPR.
Look at Deontay Johnson. He had 1 touchdown last season. One touchdown.
He was he was wide receiver 46 in standard for that number. He finished PPR wide receiver 30. He had 0 touchdowns, by the way, and 882 yards.
Yeah,
882 yards.
How does that happen? The guy is not producing.
A top 30 receiver, a guy who doesn't score a touchdown and doesn't eclipse 1,000 yards, can be a top 30 wide receiver in your PPR fantasy.
It's ridiculous to me. The point, and I get the argument that this is fantasy football, not real football, right? But the point of football is to score points and score touchdowns. Touchdowns should be king. Touchdowns always should be king.
Correct.
They shouldn't be discounted by receptions. And so what you need to do is, touchdowns are unpredictable, and that's the hard part. But when you go through, I had Deontay Johnson last year, and I traded for him early on in the season, and I cut bait with him because he just wasn't scoring, right? And those 6 points a week was not doing it for me because he wasn't scoring touchdowns. And a guy like late in the season, Isaiah Hodges, was producing touchdowns. He had 4 or 5 straight weeks with a touchdown. So that guy has more value. I don't care about how many receptions he has. He has more value because he scores and gets the ball in the end zone.
Correct.
And that should be king. And so there are patterns in that. And because receptions are predictable, it allows for players with like, you're able to predict that, right? So you're able to sit down there and do analytics and see what kind of, they're going to target short. So this guy's going to get more receptions this game. And that's great and all, but that should be a good indicator for how his end game performance is going to be, not getting the reception total.
Yeah.
And if a guy's not going to break off big, and there are a lot of times when you can look at the statistics and see, all right, well, in this defense gives up a lot of yards to tight ends. So we know the tight end is going to be big. This defense doesn't cover the slot well. So the slot receiver is going to have big games here. So to trend more towards those players. I mean, we'll talk during the season. Me and you have talked about this in the offseason. You always hear the, start your studs. But there's going to be times when you want to sit studs. And Justin Jefferson last year against the Jets was a great example of, like, they just weren't giving up yardage to number one receivers. And
I was not sitting him in a championship game, by the way. I was not doing that. But
right. And
I do agree. It was not my favorite play. But no, and not to interrupt and not to interject, but I'm on board with you. I mean, to be the devil's advocate and argue for PPR, I can see a valid reason if somebody wants to, gamify it, wants to see more points, wants to make it more arcade-like, for those who understand that term, versus it being more traditional spin-off of what football is. I would guess you could call me a traditionalist because I'm going based off of how football plays. And at the end of the day, I don't care if the guy caught 6 passes for 20 yards, versus the guy who caught 20 passes for, 2 passes for a touchdown, 20 yards and a touchdown, the points equal the same. That shouldn't be. We talk about devaluing the touchdown. That's what PPR does. But again, I like the fact that if people are playing PPR for the purpose of they want to see higher scores, they want more points, they want to keep it, a little bit crazier. They want to add bonuses and points per rush and all this stuff. Fine, have at it. Like, that's a different type of league. But to say PPR should be the quote unquote standard, no pun intended, but standard for fantasy football doesn't hold water to the argument any longer, because standard scoring is exactly how football is played. It's even across the board. I mean, if you take a look at standard scoring for the top running backs and top wide receivers, their scores are very close and similar nowadays. You don't see drastic differences. But when you take a look at Christian McCaffrey and Austin Eckler's numbers, guys who are catching 80 to 100 passes as a running back, in the running back scheme of things, you create a massive discrepancy amongst the other running backs. When you look at these top wide receivers that are going for 1,800 yards and 100 catches, they're going to be widely far ahead of these other guys who maybe catch the ball 60 times and for like 700 yards. Now, those 60 guys who catch 60 for 700 yards, you could say have now value on your squad. But it just creates more of an imbalance now in the league, just based on how
another argument is in the first round. Like, if you're in terms of drafting schematics, if you're a top 5 pick and you're drafting in PPR, like, you're in a prime position to win, because those 5 elite players, right? You look at the Justin Jeffersons, the Cooper Kupps, the Austin Eckler and the Christian McCaffreys. Those guys are going to be far and above, more potent to an offense. They can single-handedly win you a week, even in PPR. Correct. Because their numbers are so much they're exponentially higher than anyone else's, because they're not only going to lead the league in yardage and touchdowns, but they're going to lead the league in receptions. So you take a guy like Justin Jefferson last year, led the league in touchdowns, receiving touchdowns.
No, Jefferson didn't. Jefferson only had 8 last year. I think Devontae Adams led the league.
Devontae Adams did. You're right. So, but he led the league
1,800 yards. Yeah.
And he led the league in receptions.
Yeah.
So he led the league in 2 categories. So you're getting bonus on top of that, just for the sake. And you look at Austin Eckler, the same thing. Austin Eckler, his rushing totals weren't high, but the guy had 107 catches as a running back.
Yeah.
And look at McCaffrey. McCaffrey was the number 1 running back overall last year, and he would have been exponentially higher because he had 83 receptions.
Yep.
So if you don't have a guy like that, your chances of winning are slim to none. Whereas in the standard league, you can draft from the 12th position and win a championship.
Oh
You
yeah,
can
I
win
think
and
you win
draft
the
from
championship from any
any
position.
position.
Any
Yeah,
position.
yeah. You
I
don't
mean,
need to have
if
a
you
top
guys,
five pick.
yeah, and if you guys tune in next week, we are doing a way too early mock draft that you'll see kind of some of our standard league 12 team um, drafts sort of analysis and how we sort of approach the draft from the standard point of view. But I think, you know, I think you're right. I think PPR, you definitely skew those top 5 picks as if you're not in the top 5, you are really going to struggle, and you got to hope that one of those guys gets injured, or you got to hope that you hit pay dirt with somebody else and ends up, being like a quote unquote league winner for you. But that's rare. It's hard to do.
Yeah, it's extremely hard to do because you know the guys that are going to end up producing it. As long as they stay healthy, they're going to end up being the studs of the league.
So
I get it. I don't want to knock PPR too much. If you're doing
no,
DFS, like DFS, I completely agree with doing PPR and having bonus points and all that. Jump the points up because you're in a pool with 20,000 other people. Like there needs to be some kind of separation there. But when
yeah.
you're in a year-long league with 10 other people, 11 other people, you're going to it takes away from the squad management, I feel. Because in a PPR format, you can draft a full squad and set it and forget it and never touch your lineup. Like that's good. And other than bye weeks, you know who your guys are going to be. You don't have to play matchups. You don't have to look at deep analytics because you know all your guys are going to put up points, especially if you have a couple of guys that are going to throw up points every week.
And you're not always playing for the
But
touchdown.
you're not playing for the touchdown, so you just like, this guy's going to get a lot of volume. I'm going to draft for volume, and that's why it is. I feel, based on my experience with PPR, it's way easier to draft a PPR team than it is to draft a standard team.
Yeah.
It's hard to draft a standard team, but it's also equally as hard to manage a standard team during the year. If you're
I think it's
not playing the
arguably
waiver
harder
wire,
to manage it.
yeah, it's extremely hard. You need to be able to cut bait with people that are big names. Like when you see a guy like last year, I think it was week 7 or week 8. I cut bait with Deontay Johnson, and it's
Yep.
a big name that had been a big producer in the past, and he's just not that this year. And so for you to be able to cut bait with him and go get a lesser name player. I mean, last year I was filling in with Nico Collins, Isaiah Hodges. I had just people I was pulling up and playing every week that were just going week in and week out. Cole Hardman I had, and there are guys that are always going to produce. Like I said earlier in the episode, you look at the waiver wire every week, and there's at least 10 guys up there that are going to put up double-digit points, at least every week, and they go unclaimed, and no one wants a piece of them because like they're the number 2 in the offense, they're the third option receiving wise in the offense, but there's always going to be guys there. And
How many
then
times? How many
as
times is
they
Tyler Boyd sitting on the waiver wire, and everybody watches his 2 touchdown game or like 85 yards in a touchdown game, and then everybody flocks to it, and like it's not going to be a steady production, but the guy's still going to get targets and get balls, and then everybody's trying to bid for him or try and get him first, and everybody's late to the party, and then they'll drop him, and then he has another big game. Like there's value in those players still. You don't need to have a
right,
point per reception just for him to have value.
right. So
Well,
and
let me go through a couple reasons why people out there are saying PPR is better than standard, and I'd
yeah,
like to hear your thoughts on these. We kind of talked about this one. Gives other players more value, and I tend to disagree. It gives other lesser players opportunity to score a point in certain positions. It doesn't give them more value across the board unless you value points, but you sit there and you devalue the touchdown because a guy can catch 6 balls for 40 yards on little short routes and screens, and then a guy who does score a touchdown, those 6 points are like negated by those 6 catches at that point.
yeah. I don't understand that argument, to be honest with you. And like it does. Like, listen, is it gonna make lesser players valuable? Like a guy like J.D. McKissick or Theo Reddick, like those guys are gonna have more value, right? Like they're gonna move up, but if the whole bar moves up, is it really producing more value? Like everyone's moving up on that. But what you're really doing is dropping down the guys that are goal line guys that score touchdowns. I mean, you look at the year LeGarrette Blount had 20 touchdowns, right? Like he did nothing else. The amount of 100-yard games that he had was under 3.
Yeah.
You know, he was probably, 2 years ago, you look at the Ravens offense and you had Devonta Freeman and Latavius Murray, and they scored 10 points a week on 30 yards, 40 yards, and a touchdown.
Yeah.
Who cares if they're getting only 30 or 40 yards if they're getting in the end zone and they're getting the goal line work? Like that has value. Giving a guy a third down back guy, points for having reception totals doesn't. You're looking at the wrong places. Like, and again, the touchdowns aren't predictable, but there are players that are more likely to get touchdowns.
Yeah, well, like you said, Devonta Freeman and Latavius Murray, those guys come in and they get this goal line work. They may end up the game with 40 yards and a touchdown or 2, but say they get 40 yards and a touchdown, and you get some guy that goes out there and catches 6 balls for 40 yards. That devalued that touchdown, that devalued LeGarrette Blount, or not LeGarrette Blount, sorry, Latavius Murray or Devonta Freeman, and it boosted that wide receiver, wide receiver 3 that you threw into your flex at PPR by giving him the same point total as those guys that scored the touchdown. And that's where I feel like it bothers me when I hear that it gives other players more value. It does, but you're not looking at the inverse, the other side of the coin, that it's devaluing other people and their involvement in their respective teams.
Right. And one would say that the person that has more value is the guy that's scoring the touchdowns.
It should be.
Not the guy that's getting 6 receptions.
Yeah, it should be. We don't celebrate a catch, I mean,
we don't celebrate a rush. We don't celebrate a rush, a
pass. Like at the end of the day, we celebrate touchdowns more than anything in the league. So
soon we're going to get points for fair catches, just to get points.
Here's another one. Levels the playing field for pass catchers, so that includes wide receivers and tight ends, compared to running backs. And again, I think we talked about it already, that the numbers don't lie. The field is level in standard already. It is even. In fact, It's actually skewed towards the wide receiver a little bit, because at the end of the day, there's more wide receivers going for 1,000 yards, getting that 100 points in their bank right there before they even score a touchdown, versus running backs that are doing that.
Let's see this. Like seven years ago, I would say is a good estimate. You look at a first round of a draft, a standard league draft, and it's 1 through 12. It's all running backs. Now you're having wide receivers go in the top 4 picks.
Tight ends
in a standard league.
How many years ago was it? Was it 3 years ago when I debated on taking Travis Kelce first overall, because there was nobody even close to him in the league that would be able to value that position.
Right. And there's another. You want to talk about valuing the pass catcher, right? And look at the tight end position. And there are leagues that are doing a lot of other weird, the point scoring and how they want to score their, or how they want to set up their league with having no tight end in like a flex position or a super flex position. But if you look at the tight end position, there's Kels and Andrews. And then there's a huge gap, and then you have the other elite tight ends, right? But there's no one close to Kels, and there's no one close to Andrews in terms of reception totals, reception yards, and touchdowns. So if you don't get one of those guys, you're completely deficient at that position the entire year, especially in a PPR format.
More in a PPR, I feel like, than anything.
More so in a PPR format.
Because those guys are going to lead their teams in receptions, or be close to the leaders in receptions anyway on their team. Right. So you just all you did was bring everybody else up and boost them higher up, and now those other people are still in the same boat together. It doesn't. Right. It does nothing. It does no extra advantage there.
It doesn't change anything.
No. So here's another one. Non-PPR makes the running backs more important. Same argument as we just made. I think you could say that right now wide receivers are more important. They're the superstars of the NFL, in my opinion, besides the quarterbacks making all the
I
money.
don't have these stats with me, but I'd be interested in seeing how many the splits on rushing touchdowns versus receiving touchdowns. And I would argue that there's more receiving touchdowns every year in the NFL than there are rushing touchdowns.
Probably. Well, like I told you, out of running backs alone, they're only averaging in the past 3 seasons 10 running backs total that will get 9 or more touchdowns every season. So you can go into this coming season thinking like, okay, we're probably going to see only about 10 running backs get 9 or more touchdowns. Well, they're averaging 12 to 13 for wide receivers.
Right.
So you're going to say like there's going to be another 2 to 3 wide receivers on that list of the top 12 and 13 that are going to score the same amount of touchdowns as the top 10 running backs will. In fact, the top 22 receivers are going to score the same amount of yards as the top 10 running backs. So you take those numbers into effect, the people scoring those touchdowns are usually going to be the same people scoring the 1,000 yards. You can get a wide receiver in the 3rd round that's going to be better statistically than that 2nd round running back.
Yeah.
So, and that's in standard. That's not PPR, people. Here's another one. Non-PPR. Non-PPR teams, they value the running back so much that in the draft, if you're at the top of the draft, you're going to be the team that always makes the playoff, if not wins. Again, I think we debunked that pretty clearly, that in standard league, we are seeing all these wide receivers going, all these tight ends going. Sometimes you'll see quarterbacks going, and you don't need to be in the top 3 picks and get one of those CMCs or, Derrick Henrys to win the league.
2 years ago, I won from the 8th position.
Yep.
Last year, I won from the 4th position.
6. I think it was fifth position and 6th position. I think were your 2 positions you won.
I dropped last year 4.
Okay, yeah. Then it was 6th the year before that.
Yeah. So
yes, and I think
top 3 pick.
Yeah, I think I drafted from the 10 spot last year. I drafted from the 9 the year I won, or the year I drafted number 1 overall the year I won. But we are in a keeper league, so that had a little bit of weight on it. But I drafted 10 and made it to the championship last year. Like, you don't need to be in the top to get it. In fact, like, our top teams struggled
down the stretch.
Yeah, PPR is more balanced and skill based than standard scoring is.
I completely disagree.
I think the skill is taken away, in my opinion, in PPR.
I think the skill in fantasy football is management of your team throughout the season. Like, we're not talking DFS. Again, DFS is its own separate monster, and I agree with the PPR format for DFS. But if we're talking a year-long league or dynasty leagues or anything like that, the skills in managing your team. It's not in the week-to-week play. It's how you're going to do over the course of the season. Are you thinking 3-4 weeks down the road for when people have bye? Are you drafting for bye weeks? Or like those are the skills, not in okay, this guy's going to have more receptions. Like, if you have more points for everyone, but you have one of the studs at the beginning, then what skill is that? You just throw out Christian McCaffrey or Austin Eckler all year round, and then or you're going and trading for one of those guys because that team, the rest of their team stinks, and they have to trade up, or they have to trade their one valuable player to a stud team. I've seen more imbalances in leagues in PPR than I've ever seen in standard.
That's what I was going to argue. I see way more imbalances now. And again, we're not saying that there was never a time or place for PPR, because there was. We do agree when it was created out of a need. I don't necessarily think that it should have ever been created. I don't think it needed to be, but somebody out there thought it should be. And when it was created, it did give a boost to some receivers.
Someone just wanted to give value to Danny Woodhead. That's it.
All right, here's the last one. Standard scoring focuses more on elite running backs significantly more than other players.
Standard does?
Standard. That was one of the arguments I saw floating around there.
Last year, Jamal Williams was the number 7 running back in standard football.
Yep.
That's not an elite running back.
No.
He was number 7. He was a top 10 running back in standard.
Yep.
Guy had 17 touchdowns.
Yep.
He only had 17 receptions. In PPR, he's less valuable. So No, I mean, yeah, the studs are going to be the studs, but they're going to be the studs whether it's PPR or whether it's standard anyway.
Yeah.
So you can't look at the top 5 guys at each position and say this is where you're going to rate them. You got to look at the position overall.
Well, let's look at this. Would you
And
consider Saquon Barkley an elite running back in that elite
yes,
squad? Saquon Barkley finished PPR last year with 50. He did 57 receptions. So to me that's above average number. He finished 5th in PPR, so top 5 guy. He's elite. 283 points. Guess how much Justin Jefferson finished in a PPR?
340 points.
368. He almost had 100 more points, period.
Yeah.
And Justin Jefferson finished with 1,800 yards. Saquon Barkley overall yardage last year, I believe, was 1,600, almost 1,700 yards, so not far behind him. So not 100 yards, 100 points far behind him. And that's just simple. It's like Justin Jefferson caught 50 more balls.
Yeah, but who had more volume of work, Saquon or Justin Jefferson?
Saquon touched the ball, ran the ball 295 times last year, and he had 57 catches. So he touched the ball way more than Jefferson. So talk about standard scoring focus. Yeah, but when you look at, so that's what PPR does there. Now let's take a look at their standard numbers. Now, if the really elite running back focus is there, he had 226 points in standard league. Justin Jefferson in standard league, 240. He scored more than Saquon Barkley. It is not focusing on elite running backs anymore because we have receivers putting up ridiculous numbers. We have these all-stars on every team. And again, we're talking about, the best wide receiver in football last year, in that case. But you could even look at, someone like, let's pull up Devontae Adams, who scored a ton of touchdowns last year. He finished with 235, still a little bit more than Saquon. He had less yardage on the season, but he ended up scoring more touchdowns than Saquon. Again, Devontae Adams was going second round for some people's leagues last year. Saquon was going second round for some people's leagues, if not first round, because he's considered an elite guy. Where's Christian McCaffrey's numbers from last year? Let's pull him up. He finished with 271 points in a standard league. Stud. Justin Jefferson with 240 compared to 271, 30 points less. Yeah, that's an elite running back. That's a 30-point difference over the course of 18 weeks. Not very significant. But 368 for Jefferson and PPR and 356 for Christian McCaffrey. How does Justin Jefferson outscore Christian McCaffrey if Christian McCaffrey's an elite running back?
The elite running back class.
The elite running back. So that's what I'm saying. It's like standard league balances out pretty well. Like Christian McCaffrey touched the ball way more than Justin Jefferson, and it's Jefferson still had a chance to be only 30 points behind him at the end of the season. And you gets one more touchdown on the on the season, and a little bit more yardage. We're talking about a completely different game. He has 2 dud weeks at the end of the season. That's it.
It's the funniest argument that I read on Reddit today, and I just typed in PPR versus standard, and it was just like non PPR is just people that are stuck in the last century. Grow up, grandpa. And it's like
grow up, grandpa.
Join our standard league, and you'll get crushed. Like,
yeah,
you won't know how to manage your team. You won't know how to make the right play. It's so much easier overall to play in a PPR league, and it's really just that simple. I mean, like, yeah, I get PPR is fun to have all the points and have all these bonuses, and you see that your point totals go up, and you could score 200 points a week, and that's fun and all. But like, to make the argument that it's not equal, like that it balances everything out, that's a ridiculous argument.
Yeah, not anymore. Not anymore.
Not anymore. I mean, like, I agree. Like back in 2003, like that, there was a legit argument there for PPR, but the way the game has shifted, it's just not an argument anymore because the receiving totals have skyrocketed over the last 15 years. And you look at the amount of 4,000-yard throwers versus the 4,000-yard throwers 20 years ago. Half the quarterbacks in the league throw for over 4,000 yards now.
Well, like I was telling you,
those yards go to somewhere.
Yeah, like I was telling you, in 2010, they're averaging 10 quarterbacks a season. The top 10 quarterbacks each season are going to throw for 4,000 yards. I mean, the past 3 seasons, they're averaging 10 quarterbacks in the past 3 seasons, And 3 quarterbacks over that stretch of the 3 seasons threw for 5,000. 5,000.
Right.
So I agree. I think, the arguments, we can continue talking about it all the way. It's all preference, people out there. And we're not sitting here trying to tell you and sway you to play standard. We just want to give a little bit of data, give a little bit of advice of why we don't think PPR should be played for certain reasons, if that's what you're arguing, why you play it for. But if you're playing PPR to gamify, to make it arcade, see some points, all for you. I'm just not going to be the guy that's going to stand there at my TV hoping at the wee hours of the Monday Night Football game that my guy gets 2 catches to beat my opponent. Like, I want my guy to catch the ball for 30 yards to beat my opponent, period.
Except if he fumbles it and throws it backwards for 20 yards and then you lose by 1 point.
Oh,
Thanks,
yeah.
Conte.
That was rough. So, feel free, everybody. I know there was a lot to digest in today. It was more of a conversation piece between Chris and I that we talk about this every season, and we talk about our league mates. And for those league mates that are listening in, feel free to post in the comments. Those of you who are watching and stumble upon our video here, drop a comment. Tell us what you play. PPR standard. Tell us why. Tell us what your favorite parts about it is. And, we'd like to hear everything from you guys, and hope you guys like the content. Again, if you like it, like and subscribe. Again, next week, tune in. Way too early mock draft. Chris and I are going to be drafting from randomized positions, and we're going to be drafting with the rookies now in the fold. See where we get.